Om Namah Shivaya. We'll start with verse 44 of chapter 13. The forms of gods are only consciousness. The worship of Shiva is only consciousness. You are only consciousness. I am only consciousness. All is indeed only consciousness. Consciousness exists. Indeed, consciousness is existence. Wherever there is existence, there is consciousness. Whenever there is existence, which is always, then is consciousness. The essence of the gods is doubtlessly consciousness. Consciousness itself is indivisible, partless, one without a second. What of the forms of God that are seen? They partake of the same nature as the perceiver. And consciousness is the only perceiver. The worship of Shiva is only consciousness. What is the experience of worshiping Shiva? Shiva is transcendent of perception and conception. Likewise is the worship. If you abide with true knowledge, with your identity established as consciousness, you are indeed involved in the supreme form of worship, in which being and knowing and worshiping and realizing are all the same. If the worshipper knows the nature of the worshipper, that is indeed worship of Shiva. And that worship consists only of consciousness. The formless is indeed consciousness, and all the form is likewise. Consciousness itself is undifferentiated, and it alone exists. You are only consciousness. Inquire within to ascertain the truth of this. You are not a body, or the senses, or the mind, or an ego entity. All of these are the known. Consciousness is the knower. Cease to define the knower in terms of the known. Cease to attribute what is not the self to the self. If you inquire in this manner, what are you but consciousness? As consciousness, you are unborn and imperishable. As consciousness, you are unchanging and never modified. As consciousness, you have no beginning or end. As consciousness, you have no ignorance or its consequent suffering. Identify yourself as consciousness, which is a matter of thought-transcendent knowledge. You are only consciousness. I am only consciousness. There is no other I but I. Realize this with non-objective knowledge. The only I in you is consciousness, the infinite, the eternal. You are not the individual who is assumed to be in ignorance, in delusion. You are only consciousness. I am only consciousness. All is indeed only consciousness. Consciousness is the existence. And there exists nothing else out of which anything could be created. So if there is all, if something's been created. It is only consciousness. If nothing has been created, then of course there is only consciousness. All is indeed only consciousness. Consider what you suppose you are experiencing. What do you regard as real? And what do you regard as yourself, your identity? All is only consciousness, perceived or conceived as that thing. The conception too is only consciousness. So that there is really no substance out of which to create illusion. If you realize this much, it will suffice. It will yield lasting peace and happiness. But we'll continue. Verse 45. The nature of the Supreme is only consciousness. Afflictionless-ness is only consciousness, always. The permanent is only consciousness. The goal is only consciousness. By practices of all kinds, attempts are made to realize the Supreme. That for which you are searching is your own consciousness. Being self-luminous and immeasurable. The Self is the Supreme. Afflictionless-ness is only consciousness, always. How to be free of all suffering. how to be free of all suffering always. You must rest in something that is always. What is always? If you think of yourself as something else, such as a body, etc., then there will be affliction. For such things are bound to be destroyed. The permanent is only consciousness. Within you, what is permanent? The body is not permanent. Bodily experiences, sensations and such, are not permanent. What is permanent? Thoughts are not permanent. If you misidentify with them, you will be afflicted. To dissolve the affliction, find that in you which is permanent, which do not begin with the birth of the body and will not perish with the death of the body. Which do not come into being by a thought and will not be lost when thought changes. Identify yourself as consciousness and thereby set yourself free of all afflictions. Then you enjoy an inner bliss and peace that will not come to an end. For the cause of ending, impermanence, is absent. The goal is only consciousness. For your spiritual practice, you have a goal. That goal may be called self-realization, or God-realization, or knowledge of Brahman, or knowledge of Shiva, and so on and so forth. What is the nature of the goal? If you realize that the goal is of the nature of consciousness, you'll understand why it's imperative that you inquire with non-objective knowledge. If the goal is only consciousness, the ideas of a separated attainment and one who attains are removed. How close, or what is the distance between consciousness and yourself? So if consciousness is the goal, if that is its nature, you are already where you need to be. There is no distance to traverse, no chasm to cross. It is right where you are, but by that we do not mean some place in the world or some place in the body or something perceived by the senses. Where you are. And who are you? Consciousness is truly your only identity. Verse 46. Dispassion is only consciousness. Attributeless-ness is only consciousness always. Moving about is only consciousness. Mantra and tantra are only consciousness. Dispassion is the result of discrimination. Discrimination is the nature of consciousness. And the fruit it yields is of the same nature. Abidance as consciousness is the sure way to gain dispassion. Knowing yourself to be consciousness, what would disturb your inherent peace? The inherent peace born of detachment or dispassion is rooted in that which is undifferentiated. The undifferentiated is the attributeless. What can we say consciousness is? It remains forever undefined, though conclusively realized. The quality of being attributeless belongs only to consciousness. Indeed, it is not a quality at all, in which one has a quality and the qualified. The reality is just consciousness. It cannot be grasped by the mind, yet it can be realized in mind-transcendent knowledge. Do not move from the attributeless self. Do not let the mind be extroverted. Do not move to the unreal. But remain as you truly are. But if in your experience you seem to move, you should know that all the moving is also just consciousness. In the same way that we say knowledge and ignorance are both of the nature of consciousness. The non-dual truth is that there is no alternative. The real is, and ever is, permanent. The unreal never is. All that there is just consciousness. Similarly, the nature of all the mantras, whether they be Vedic or otherwise, is the very same consciousness. And the nature of Tantra, whether we consider that as the system of thought, or we consider it pertaining to the texts, scriptures that go by that name. Everything, all of it, is only of the nature of consciousness. Verse 47. This universe is of the nature of consciousness. All the three worlds are only of the nature of consciousness. The ego is of the nature of consciousness. The highest of the high is of the nature of consciousness. Existence is itself consciousness. Everywhere there is existence. There is not a speck of this universe that is apart from the existence. And the existence is consciousness. The truth is very vast. Because of its expansive nature, it is called Brahman. It is vast beyond conception. It is vast beyond any idea of vastness. And all of this, without exception, is the one consciousness. Realizing this is immortal bliss. all the three worlds are only of the nature of consciousness. All that is gross, all that is subtle, and all that is causal. All of that is just the ever-same consciousness. It corresponds to the experiences one has while awake, while dreaming, and in deep dreamless sleep. Those states or those worlds are composed of what? Only transcendent consciousness. Which is beyond the content of those states. The ego is of the nature of consciousness, which is to say there is really no ego at all. For the notion of an ego is the idea of being identified with a separate knower, an individual who is distinct from the infinite consciousness. But if there is nothing to that notion but consciousness, why, your natural state is completely egoless. The highest of the high is of the nature of consciousness. In the realm of the mind, there can always be the possibility of something more, something higher. Beyond the mind, there is no such possibility. How could there be anything higher than the one without a second? The highest of the high is of the nature of consciousness. Verse 48. All this difference is an aspect of, or of the nature of, consciousness. Even a blade of grass and such are aspects of consciousness. The space of consciousness is of the nature of consciousness. Formlessness is of the nature of consciousness. Right where we think we see difference, there exists actually only the indivisible one, pure consciousness. Everything, from the vastest to the smallest, to even what appears insignificant, like a blade of grass, all these are of the nature of consciousness. All that you ever experience, all that can be experienced, is only of the nature of consciousness, seen apparently as that very thing. Everything is contained within the space of consciousness, the space of the mind, the space of the universe. All this is within the space of consciousness. And the nature of the space of consciousness is consciousness. Just consciousness as it is formless. Realize the formlessness of truth, and you found the eternal, the permanent. Realize the formlessness of your consciousness, and you will have found the self. For this, inquire, who am I? Om Namah Shivaya.